Wonderful. Okay, I think we can move on to the next theme that we found quite interesting. I think that was focusing more on, and I'm sure there are some attendees here that will be very close to their heart, is around ongoing monitoring for crypto assets, PEPs, sanction screening, adverse media. Right? It's nice and well to onboard a customer and do your background checks and validate their ID and background and all that. But how do you, especially in large data sets, right? Or a startup, right, which is scaling quickly, how do you tackle that particular issue in terms of just the sheer volume that comes back? You know, we're dealing with false positives or simple reports, etc. So I'll go to Jesse for at least the crypto angle on that front. Jesse, what do you think? You know, once you have lots of exchanges that are your clients, or lots of broker dealers that are your clients in that space, how are they addressing this particular challenge?
Well, I mean, in relation to the crypto data itself, one of the inherent values that you have is the provenance and the traceability and the connectivity that you have. So you're not dealing with false positives in the sense of things like transaction monitorings, which is which is really unprecedented. One of the things that attracted me to this space, particularly to Chainalysis, is I come from traditional financial services, and what we know to be true a few years ago, prior to when I joined, and to be true today, if we're being honest, is that real-time transaction monitoring in traditional financial services is still not something that really can be applied at scale, right, effectively. What you have in relation to illicit finance is a reactive process where that illicit activity will be executed. Typologies, red flags will be developed, implemented into a program. You try to arrest it going forward. But because of the traceability and connectivity with cryptocurrency, any transfer that has been conducted, right, between these wallets is tracked and is followed. And when illicit activity has occurred, that is flagged and identified as well, meaning that the transaction history associated with any wallet, with any token, lives on in perpetuity. So real-time transaction monitoring does occur, you know. Alerts are provided, and not only is that identifying things like direct exposure, but indirect exposure as well. With that being said, however, you know, the regulatory ecosystem is such that it is still developing around the globe. Not all of these exchanges are the same, as you know, and the kinds of entities that are in the virtual asset space. Some of them may be introducing a culture of compliance, others may not. In short, right? And so you do still have issues like regulatory arbitrage and other issues that exist. On the issue of KYC that we just mentioned, some choose to implement robust KYC. Others may not have any KYC at all, depending on the jurisdiction and the kind of operation. So there are some vulnerabilities that exist. There is some real potential in relation to how technology can be applied. It is all digital and it is cross-border. As you mentioned, frictionless payments that can move very quickly. For that reason, these choke points of the exchanges really have to implement global KYC policies and procedures, UBO collection. We are moving in that direction as a result of things like FATF, but it is very important and timely.
Thank you, Jesse. Stuart, so I think this is right down your alley, right? So in terms of the PEPs, the negative news, the ongoing stuff, right? You know, the point that I'm trying to get at is, you know, for example, you onboard company X, and then everybody is squeaky clean at the outset, and suddenly there's some, you know, some transfers of equity or something like that, or associations that come up. And those are questionable or related to PEPs, or people are, you know, in some sort of a UN sanctioned program. In a fast-paced environment, you know, the point that I'm trying to get at is, especially in a fintech space where the scale is achieved quickly and there's a lot of things happening quickly, how can a compliance team address the challenge of a lot of that feedback, right? And how to separate noise from real stuff that they need to look at. So what would be your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think we could do hours on this topic. It's an important one. It is near and dear to my heart. But I think there's a lot of things. There are a lot of things not to do. There are a lot of things not to do that other rapidly growing fintechs have done, like turn off transaction monitoring because you have too many alerts, which was something that I think Revolut ran into in Europe. And I would not be doing those sorts of things, and I would be investing in doing this correctly from the beginning. And when I say doing it, there's an assumption that people are doing it, and I think that assumption that everyone is doing PEP sanctions and adverse media screening to begin with is happening is in and of itself not necessarily true. And so I would say first and foremost, do it. And the reason I say that is there I believe recently, maybe a couple of months ago, an OFAC finding in the US on a crypto related company for not doing sanction screening at all in the United States. And there obviously would be trade-offs between growth, investors pushing you to grow fast, and maybe I'll get around to doing sanction screenings or compliance later. That's just that's a no-go. There's a large payment processor in Europe that we're working with through an intermediary. One of the largest payment processors in Europe has no CIP program. So working cross-border, working globally, could be working with anybody. It's really hard to know who they're working with, who the risk of those entities are. I think that's a problem. And then we're working with a number of entities that just don't do adverse media screening. And so I think that there are reasons why these aren't done. Maybe it's because folks want to grow quickly, maybe because there's a cost element associated with this. But what I would argue is that it is certainly manageable if you sort of start with the right grounding in the beginning, which is to think about what is the business that I'm in, where am I going to be operating, and that sort of goes back to the UBO and KYC discussion earlier, and what is the sort of risk-based approach that I want to put in place with regards to sanctions, with regards to PEPs, and with regards to news. I would say that all three of these aren't created equally, and they apply differently depending on the entity in question and what their risk-based approach really is. A great sort of sub-example of that would be PEPs, and thinking about what level of PEP do you need to be looking at? Do you need to be looking at all domestic PEPs? Do you need to be looking at all level 4 and level 3 PEPs, or is it okay to make the effort, as was said earlier, and look at level 1 and level 2 PEPs and reduce the amount of returns or hits that you might be getting as you scale and grow your organization? You might be able to get away with doing that. And so I would just sort of say being very thoughtful about this from the beginning is important. Once you get going, once your organization starts growing and your client base starts growing, it gets harder and harder to play catch up. And once that's in place, thinking very carefully about your risk-based approach, how you put this in place, and how you work with your technology provider and your data vendor to help you tune this in the way that will work best for your organization. It is all ultimately tunable, and the purpose of all of this is, again, to make the effort to try to identify those risks that need to be reported to law enforcement, and to be set up properly to do that, and be working internally to do that, and working externally with experts to ensure that you have this in place in the right way. The only other thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is as Jehanzeb mentioned, the ongoing piece of this. So a company or an individual that you work with might be fine at the point of onboarding, but it's really that ongoing piece that's really critical. And I personally worked with an institution in the GCC when I was with EY on a look back that hadn't looked at their customer base and done a refresh of any kind for a decade. And I would argue that a decade is a long time. The Manhattan Project took 4 years. So we need to be looking at stuff more than every 10 years. And ideally, leveraging technology very cost effectively, you can look at this daily, and you should be.
Yeah. So Stuart, you made me think of one, sorry to jump in, you made me think of the conversations and the debates you were having 5 years ago, maybe 10, which was, you bolt on cybersecurity later, right? It was like, oh, now we have to really think about.
Yeah, now we bring that in. Yeah.
And of course, now, a CTO would be fired if it wasn't part of how you actually set up your core infrastructure. And probably the same is true. I'm seeing that trend happen for data science. You can't add data science later. You have to bring it in at the beginning and have the right setup. Otherwise, both those things will just blow up your tech cost. I think, there's a real opportunity for AML KYC professionals here to work in partnership with tech and come up with the right strategic architecture at the outset.
Yes.
And not, and mentally, it's for those professionals to get out of the mindset of we come later, we're an infrastructure area. This is the business. If you start getting fines for this, it's going to blow up all equity value you have in your company. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of examples in yours. So I think, there's a real opportunity to get ahead of this, work your data science teams. There's no reason why you can't do this daily and actually drive insights that create alpha.
Exactly. Yes.
That's what has to be the focus. But I think the starting point comes with the individuals in the organization to start thinking as commercial business centers to really drive the innovation forward, as opposed to waiting for someone to notice that there's an opportunity here. Just my take, but I was on panels 5 years ago talking about this, and it's exactly the same with cyber.
No, absolutely. I think I would want to add a point here. Typically, when it comes to fintech, especially in the region, there's a little bit of in the crypto space. I think that there is some concerns, and the risk-based approach is quite robust. For other fintechs, it's a bit more relaxed, I would say. And it is potentially, when there will be a blow up, that's when sort of the regulators will probably start looking at it a bit more.
Here's the thing. I'm sorry, you got me passionate about something now. We don't have to wait for the regulator to come up with the solution. I think they can be part of the solution. Again, if I look at the Nordics on Bank ID, that was the banks building the core infrastructure. That solution adds 5% to the GDP each year of Sweden. There is an exciting opportunity for me if I look at the Middle East, which I live there, I'm passionate about it. To get this right, this could transform the Middle East into the power, into a real powerhouse of being able to solve some of these complex challenges very, very easily. The technology actually is freely available today. It's not going to be hard. I'd love to see that. Jehanzeb, you should build, I think, with your company.
Just to jump in there, Jehanzeb, I think back to James's point. I think given the geographic location that we cover, again, I mean, it's probably the most risky, and that kind of makes it much more difficult for regulators also from a report AML and compliance perspective. Hence, also it becomes more difficult for fintechs to get regulated by the regulator, because the regulator is very much concerned about what are their AML and compliance, that's internal procedures. So that's where we ourselves do a lot of work and try and get technology firms that can actually enable the regulator to detect or to be able to work with these fintechs, and also connect the technology providers with the fintech companies as well, to be able to develop a product for them which will help, which will satisfy the regulators' requirements. But again, as Jehanzeb and anyone that has worked in the region, it is one of the biggest challenges that we face, given the geography that we cover.